Why should we even care about an obscure economic concept like perfect competition? Well, it turns out that perfect competition has not only permeated our thinking in economics, but has permeated the thinking in legal and regulatory structures. For instance, in the US, it underpins antitrust law and securities laws. Perfect competition is when there's a large number of sellers and they drive the price down so that there's no profit, or at least there's no economic profit, which means that the profit that they get is equal to what they'd get on a safe return like treasuries. Wikipedia describes perfect competition as a market in which there's a large number of buyers and sellers, and none of them have pricing power, and they buy and sell a homogeneous product. As far as I can tell, Milei was happily teaching perfect competition in his microeconomics classes until he ran into new growth theory, and he sensed there was a contradiction. In this clip, Milei explains how this led him to the ideas of Murray Newton Rothbard.
The point is that if you look at that prediction function that explains growth, it's a production function that shows growing performance. And growing performance is not consistent in the neoclassical theory. With monopolies, with the perfect competition. In other words, they actually explain the monopolies. And the vision that one gets from a monopoly is that the monopoly is bad when one studies microeconomics. So the point is, how could something that took so many people out of poverty be bad? Where is the concept of perfect competition in Adam Smith? That is a neoclassical construction. Why? Because when the neoclassics had to choose between the factory of subsidiaries, that is the growing performance and the invisible hand, placed in the vision of Pareto, where everyone maximizes. If you have a growing function, what is the problem? That supposedly they can't find a maximum. So, the figure of Pareto maximizing well-being, maximizing consumers, and maximizing variables to be able to deduce demand functions. I said, of course, then I didn't give him the optimal Pareto. You know what the optimal Pareto is? It seems like garbage to me. And I'm going to explain it to you. This one wants to undermine everything. Well, partly yes, but the issue is the following. The optimal Pareto says what is an optimal Pareto, or situation that is not optimal Pareto. When you can improve someone without making someone worse, that is called better Pareto. It means that they were not in the optimal Pareto. When that runs out, they are already in the optimal Pareto. Look how easy it is. Now let's look at this example. Suppose Edison appears and invents the lamp. How do you think the candle makers were? I'm going to give you the technical vocabulary. The horse, they wanted to kill him, Now I say, all this conference is possible thanks to Edison's invention. I say this because with the candles do not generate much light. The reality is that technological progress generates that. But then what? I'm going to mistreat technological progress in the name of the optimal Pareto, because now I'm going to apply a little more tone of life. Suppose that a pill cures all else is invented, so that people will live forever and young. In other words, as my friend Jose Luis Cordero says, we are going to see the death of a death. The fraud that says that in the name of the optimal Pareto. Come and accept responsibility for the burials, for the cemeteries, for those who make the hunkers. I don't give a damn. In other words, I prefer to live, not die. In other words, so that you have an idea of how stupid this is, that sometimes the economic theory is loaded with. So I'm going to simplify the concept of monopoly, which is the one that Lord Edward Coke gave. In other words, look at what a name, Coke. I thought it was an advance. Basically, what I said is that there are two types of monopoly in the background. There is the legal monopoly and the situation in which a company is left alone. What is wrong is the legal monopoly. That is where the state, I should say the current monarch, uses the repressive apparatus that is the monopoly of violence, so that you cannot compete with others. I mean, of course, then, the one who stays in that trap. And they hunt in the sea. And of course, people are for the sake of it. I'm face. I mean, but that doesn't mean that a monopoly is bad. Because if in reality the monopoly is that of a single company is left if the market, that competing with a law, managed to sell a product of better quality at a better price, is a hero, is a social benefactor, well, the neoclassical economy is left with this picture, that you have marginal income equal to marginal cost, and from a determine a price that would be above the competitive, and you have an income. Of course, because it is an exercise, a world of partial equilibrium. Put it in general balance and in dynamic times. Others are going to come in. Or do you think that God is going to be making money? And everyone is going to say to me, oh, look how he makes money. Now, except that the monarch, that is, the state, blocks the entrance. I mean, as you can see, the problem is always a state. And now let's go to the other point. Why, let's say, the neoclassical theory, that a perfect competition needs so many players. Another stupidity, an absolutely deranged concept. Nothing to do with what Adam Smith said. What is interesting, this graph shows it perfectly. You hear of what is called the optimal number of plants, and depending on where the demand causes, it is going to be the number of plants that you are going to have. So what happens? If you have, let's say the demand is here directly, then the optimal thing would be for there to be a company alone, because the cost you would have associated with 2 plants would be much higher than 1. So there is room for 1. The breakpoint is basically this. If the demand curve was on this side, the cost of having 2 plants would be lower than having 1. And then what would happen? There would be 1 more plant. There would be room for 1 more company. So how much is the maximum inefficiency that there can be? It is this little triangle that is here. Yes. If the demand is right, it cuts there. Now what happens? As all plants would be the same. The triangle will always have the same size. So how do they make that potential inefficiency disappear? That the number of companies tends to be infinite. So a finite number over a number that tends to be infinite, how much does it give? Sir. So they have the perfect competitive balance. In other words, nothing to do with reality, nothing to do with what makes sense in life, but a pure mathematical structure to be able to have the optimum for this, which we saw was crap. In other words, it is absurd. And as if all this were not enough, it is assuming a production function that lies behind the data because today it was given to me to be elegant. What is interesting, I say that within the neoclassical logic there are authors who have corrected this, which is the case of Bomo, by putting the curve of average cost in the flat background that allows free entry and exit and generates an optimum result of Pareto. Again, even when there was only 1 company. But again, the problem is the optimum of Pareto. Look, by embracing the optimum of Pareto, all the disasters I shared with the economic theory for something that is essentially crap. So let's go to the one who has it clear. I'm going to tell you the anecdote. Let's say I was a recaster neoclassic. I gave more than 20 years of micro classes. So I was familiar with these issues of growth, and I said, but if growth is good, it brings people out of poverty. How can monopolies be bad? So I was desperate. So I ran into the Austrians, and there I ran into this man called Murray Newton Rothbard. You will never hear about him. I warn you, never. Because all institutions are centers of indoctrination that create Marxists. Never when they talk about Van Mises. Surely they will think that he is the new Dutchman, not a guy who is great, because Rothbard is the heir of Mises. So I read an article translated by Alberta Venedis Lynch, the great father, Alberto Venegas Lynch, son, which is called Monopoly and Competence, and which is in a book called The Man, the Economy and the State. I warn you that in the first 2 volumes, Rothbard is a monarchist in the 4th, which is called Power and Market, and it is a pleasure to be an anarcho-capitalist. But I see details. What is happening here? The first is the idea of free market or intervened market. I do not care about the number of agents. What I care about is whether or not the systematical coaxing entity that has the monopoly of violence, which is called the state. Then there is the issue of monopolies, provinces, and substitution. I mean, what good is it to have the monopoly? A saline keeps in Antarctica? Not at all. But suppose I do not use such an extreme case. I'm not going to use a few more minutes. But then, let's say, what's going on? Can I substitute? We've already seen the issue of the optimal and Pareto. And another thing that also represents a problem has to do with the issue of the inputs. Because in reality, if I am a single operator in the market, I'm going to everything the same. You know that the price of the inputs are going to rise, and the benefits are going to fall. Something is going to fail, surely. But also, the other thing you have to take into account, that the case where an agent controls everything, that already existed. It was called communism, and it ended badly, because it could not do economic calculation. So, if a company, for some reason, starts to grow shamelessly, the process itself will abort it, because it will not be able to do economic calculation. And then, obviously, all this logic of envy and hatred and resentment are the benefits of the monopolist. What can the monopolist do with the benefits? He can save it. If he saves them, what does he do? He becomes an investor in another sector. He creates work and he comes to another sector. What can he do? He can reinvest it, with which he is going to generate better products at better prices. He is still a hero. He can consume it, with which he generates work in another part of the economy, where he is consuming. Look, it's a fucking escape. It's a capital escape. He raises the price of foreign currency. He assigns the resources to the transferable sector of the economy. In fact, it's so fucked up. It's so fucked up that he grabs the money and puts it under the ground. Look how fucked up he is. He's a bad guy. They are going to lower the prices. That is the whole benefit. That is to say, to not fall into the fallacy of what is not seen, which is what the Keynesians always fall into, right? So, let's go now with the values of capitalism. First point, you know what? There is something that a left wing cannot stand. It's the data, because the data destroys its narrative. Look, those economies that are free grow more than twice as much as those that are repressed. In fact, the GDP per capita of countries that are free is at least 8 times higher. Moreover, the left wing always speaks of the most vulnerable. The most vulnerable live much better in the countries that are free. They're 11 times better, and if you look, not only are they better than the most vulnerable, but they are 2 times better. Then what is the GDP of the repressed countries? In other words, they can't do anything. In fact, poverty is 24 times less. And as if this was not enough, people live longer. In other words, what is the point? Because the evidence in PIC takes it into account. In other words, because you are all very young. And in the 1989 something happened. Something fell that was called the Berlin Wall and crushed the left wing, not the capitalists. And when it crushed them, the truth appeared. They were poor. It was a failure economically, socially, culturally, and as if this was not enough, that murder system killed ever more than 100 million human beings. In addition, socialist scum are the champions of human rights. Houston, we have a problem. What are the institutions of capitalism? There are two that go hand in hand. You can see it in my article today, which is more in depth, which is private property and free market. In other words, if government can appropriate the fruit of your work, what are you going to work for? Obviously, what do you want the fruit of your work for? Either to enjoy it or to exchange it with another. Hence, free markets are voluntary exchanges. In other words, because without voluntary exchanges, if the government is there and does not allow you to make voluntary exchanges, then you will not produce either. Because what do they want it for? To have it and not use it is the same as not having private property, with which they go hand in hand. The competition is not the perfect competition. The competition is free entry and exit. That the monarch or the state is not blocking free entry and exit.
Milei thinks that the idea of perfect competition is nonsense. And as long as there is free entry and free exit from a market, then there is no monopoly. This seems to have also led him to the idea that all neoclassical economics is wrong. All inventions, and therefore all technological progress, which drives economic growth, is inconsistent with perfect competition. Milei makes this point using Edison's invention of the incandescent light bulb and candle makers. Not only are inventions inconsistent with perfect competition since they imply unique information held by one party, but every property right gives market power by definition. In fact, people who push perfect competition to its limits have used it to attack property rights. As a result, we need to eliminate all antitrust laws, and we need to re-examine all the laws related to securities. This next clip is a speech in which Milei also talks about perfect competition. Unfortunately, it's not as well translated as the first clip.
The third institution is competition, but this has to be clear that the institution of competition is not what we study in the manuals of neoclassical economy, in a microeconomics manual, or let's see, Hayek said that it was, let's say, I am going to adapt it to my words, that the perfect competition model was stupid, because the perfect competition model had anything but competition. If they were all acceptable prices, it was a stupid model. So, and that, let's say, in Adam Smith, this is clear, and in the Austrians, this is also clear that the idea of competition does not have to do with a large amount, with atomistic agents, as it would be called in a traditional microeconomics, but it has to do with what is a free entry and exit, a concept that was raised by William James Bummel to develop the theory of disputable markets. That is, what matter to achieve the social optimum was the free entry and exit. Now, the point is the following. Why, let's say, the neoclassics clung to that idea? Actually, they clung to that idea because of a question that has to do with the optimum of Pareto. If you, let's say, decide a set of production with marginal performance of growth, SEA, associated with them, are going to find mid-cost curves in the form of U, then you could look at the cost of a certain amount of plants. That is what also gives rise to the concept of cost utility. How many companies enter an industry, and you will realize that if you have mid-cost functions in the form, if you what will determine if they go from one company to two, has to do with where the mid-cost curves of one plant and of two plants. So the maximum of efficiency is given just by that point where those T curves coincide. Since that is a fixed number, finite when the number of companies tends to n, or when n tends to infinity, that number is distributed in n, that if it tends to infinity, 8 becomes 0 and you reach the efficiency. That is to say, all the discussion of the wall in the background has a problem linked to a mathematical structure. In addition, and all that discussion, if I put myself in the model of Adam Smith, characterized by the factory of pins and the invisible hand, basically what did the neoclassics do? They threw at the edge the idea of the pin factory, that is, the growing yield, and they stayed with the idea of the invisible hand, but in the world version, which is an aberration. Since I am in the background, I will explain why I consider that the optimal of the wall is an aberration. For those who are not informed, I tell you, suppose that you have a situation where the economy is at a certain point. If you can make an improvement without harming someone, that is going to be called a world improvement. That is, you are not in the optimal. When there's possibilities of improvement are exhausted, you are precisely in the optimal of the wall. That is, you cannot improve someone without harming another. Basically, that would be the idea. So let's see why this idea is aberration. I ask you a question. What do you think happened to the candle makers? Did they Edison invented the lamp? If they could, they would fill them with kicks. I mean, if they had been for 50 years, at least without being able to sit down. However, we all use electric lights. Yes, but now I'm going to put an example, a little more violent. So let's say we are getting hot. Yes, they want to. Let's suppose the following. Someone appears. Yes, who creates the pill that cures all ills, and we can become eternal in the state that we want. How ugly to say state, but let's say. We can choose what age to live in these eternally young and everything like that. We are not going to lack the terror that in the name of the optimum of Pareto is going to say, but the coffin manufacturers for the dead are going to break. So, it is free to see how violent it can be. They're going to impose who created this pill. They're going to disincentivize that activity. That is what the bureaucrat does. They condemn us to death. The intervention of the state condemns to death. They are the first to say no, but it is going to be generated. How many times have you heard no, because technology is called the playful fallacy? This in a book by Hazlitt. I already treated them there in the middle of the 50s in a book called The Economy. In one lesson there is an article called Hate the Machine. Now I'll ask you a question. If in the year 1810, 1,000 million people lived on planet Earth, if technology, which is what is characterized technological progress in the last 200 years, were unemployment, and today there are 7,250 million people on planet Earth, someone began to think that if it were true, today the unemployment rate would be 85%, which nobody thinks, because it is a mess, the size of a house.
Capitalism is not about driving down the prices of existing goods, which is the whole idea behind perfect competition. As Milei's example shows, even if we could get candles for no cost at all, we'd still prefer incandescent light bulbs. Perfect competition is inconsistent with freedom and inconsistent with economic progress, which is why Milei has rejected it outright.